It provides the connection that might be termed a missing link. Geologically, it proves beyond question the existence of a great prehistoric continent of land in the Pacific Ocean. Much of the present elevation of the islands of the Pacific Ocean is due to the lowering of the ocean's level. I have made a somewhat rough calculation as to how much the Earth's diameter has been reduced by the blowing out of gas chambers and the compacting of the rocks, and find that it totals between 17 and 21 miles. Chapter 14, The Origin of Savagery. In the chapter on the destruction of Mu, I showed how the first savagery originated upon the earth. Man was created a civilized being, and the destruction of the motherland affected only those who survived the catastrophe and made their homes on the barren islands, which were left out of the water after the proud cities and buildings had vanished forever. A nation loses the place which it once held in the world's history when money becomes more precious to the souls of its people than honesty and honor. A universal, widespread greed of gain is the forewarning of some great upheaval and disaster. Civilizations have been born and completed and then forgotten again and again. There is nothing new under the sun. What is has been. All that we learn and discover has existed before. Our inventions and discoveries are but reinventions, rediscoveries. The orthodox theory among scientists of today is that man came up from a brute beast to a savage, and from savagery traveled on by degrees until he reached civilization. I do not stand alone when I say that savagery came out of civilization, not civilization out of savagery. It is only those who know nothing of savages who maintain that civilization emerged from savagery. Baron von Humboldt, in speaking of the groups of Indians he met along the Amazon and Orinoco rivers, naively remarks, "They are not the crude material of humanity, nor from this state have we risen. These hapless beings are the last remnants of some dying race which has fallen to this state. Man in a state of nature is a doomed being, doomed to death. A savage left to himself does not rise. He has fallen to where he is and is still going down. It is only when he is brought into contact with civilization that an upward change in him becomes possible. The savage, when brought into contact with civilization, does one of two things. He either absorbs civilization and rises, or he absorbs vice, adds to his own vices, and becomes brute-like and falls still lower. Such are doomed to early extinction. There have been two causes that have evolved savagery among various peoples, and both were due to geological phenomena. At the end of the geological tertiary era, the Earth's crust had been cleared of old Archean gas chambers to a sufficient depth for the gases to form belts and to raise mountains. The foregoing is explained in my geological work. Before this time, there were no mountains or even high hills. The habitable earth consisted of immense fertile plains, thickly populated. In forming the gas belts, the land above was lifted into mountain ranges. A belt passing under a thickly populated plain in lifting the land fractured it and broke it up, killing most of the people. A few, however, survived among the broken-up mountains. Those which were left on the plains, on the land which had not been raised, suffered a worse fate, for all were destroyed by the great cataclysmic waves which rolled over the plains from the oceans. This not only destroyed all life, but for a time the productiveness of the land as well. These survivors could not return to the plains, for there all was desolation. There was nothing to eat, and so great became their sufferings that they ate one another, and thus through one of the two geological changes, mountains raising, cannibalism was born into the world. In some instances, when the mountains went up, large flat areas were carried up with them, and on this land lived the men and women who had once known all the luxuries of a great civilization. In time they lost all knowledge of the higher arts and sciences. They became savages and lived as such. The most conspicuous instance of this sort was the great Uyghur Empire of Central Asia. The eastern half was destroyed by the waters of the biblical flood, and all thereon perished. Afterwards, the western half went up, forming the Himalaya and other Central Asiatic mountains. Among these mountains were many plateaus, where the people survived and finally worked their way back into various flat countries. Those of the Uyghurs who survived were the forefathers of the Aryan races. In both India and China there are traditions relating to the raising of these mountains, the great loss of life that ensued, and the survival of many who lived in the mountains following the great upheaval. Among the Zulus of South Africa, there are traditions that their forefathers were a company who survived during the raising of the mountains in the north. In South Africa, the whole city of Tiahuanaco went up with the great plateau that now exists between the two ranges of the Andes. In South America, the whole city of Tiahuanaco went up with the great plateau that now exists between the two ranges of the Andes. This is told by the inscription on the great door that is so well known to archaeologists on the shores of Lake Titicaca. In most mountainous countries, there are traditions concerning the raising of the mountains. The raising of mountains is referred to in the Bible, is one of the Psalms of David called the Song of Moses, Psalms 92. Scientists of today, in judging the character and advancement of a civilization, lay great stress on flint arrow and spearheads. Thus they say that because the arrow and spearheads of Neolithic times were of a higher type of manufacture than these same particles during the Paleolithic times, the Neolithic men were more civilized than the Paleolithic men. I do not say that our scientists are wrong, but this evidence does not appeal to me as showing the state of a civilization, except in the reverse way, namely, the Paleolithic men were more civilized than the Neolithic men, and there are many opposing facts arrayed against the scientist's theory. It is quite within the realms of reason to believe also that at the time the flint arrow and spearheads were being fashioned, conditions were somewhat similar to those of today in this respect, that all individuals were not equally expert in manufacture. A trained mechanic turns out a perfect article, a novice, an inferior and crudely formed one. The men of the Paleolithic times were novices, but were they less civilized? Personally, I think not. These novices were the remnants of highly civilized people, suddenly thrown on their beam ends by one of the many convulsions of the earth during what is called Paleolithic times. The assertion that the more crude and primitive a stone arrow or spearhead is, the more highly civilized were the people who made them, may seem illogical on its face, but think, carry your mind back to ancient times, and see how man repeatedly was robbed of everything except his bare hands, and thrown entirely on nature's resources. Tools and everything else were gone. Absolutely nothing was left except the brains and the fingers of the survivors. Without the slightest knowledge of mechanics, these remnants had to commence making tools out of nothing but the stones at their feet. Could anything but the crudest forms be fashioned by them without experience and without knowledge? I think not. To me, these crude arrow and spearheads do not show savagery or a low civilization. They show a high civilization passing down into savagery. Thus the scientist Paleolithic men were of a higher civilization than the Neolithic men who followed them, and as the manufacture improved, these human beings went down. Chapter 15. Ancient Religious Conceptions. Max Muller says, religion is a mental faculty which, independent of, nay, in spite of sense and reason, enables man to apprehend the infinite under different names and under different disguises. Without that faculty, no religion, not even the lowest worship of idols and fetishes, would be possible. And yet, if we will but listen attentively, we can hear in all religions a groaning of the spirit, a struggle to conceive the inconceivable, to utter the unutterable, a longing after the infinite, a love of God. The intention of religion, wherever found or wherever we meet it, is always holy. However imperfect, however childish a religion may be, it always places the human soul in the presence of God. And however imperfect, however childish the conception of God may be, it always expresses the highest ideal of perfection which the human soul, for the time being, can reach and grasp. Every mythology appears as the result of the earliest efforts of the human mind to explain mysteries of the universe: the sky, the sun, the planets, the winds and the clouds, the summer and winter, the dawn and darkness, and the varied elemental phenomena which are of supernatural significance to the simple fancies of uncultured people. A myth starts from a conception, an idea. The mind invents facts to embody and present it. Myths are the impression of the way primitive man represented things to himself under the influence of naturalism. Muller in Early Religions says, "In one sense, every religion has been a true religion at the start. They were the only religions that were possible at the time, which were compatible with the language, the thoughts, and the sentiments of each generation, which were appropriate to the age of the world. We ought therefore to put the most charitable interpretation on the apparent absurdities, the follies, and the errors of ancient religions. As soon as we know anything of the thoughts and feelings of man, we find him in possession of a religion of faith or worship, or morality or ecstatic vision, a religion of fear and hope, or surmise, a reverence of the so-called gods. In order to approach the religion of primitive peoples, we must, so to speak, get at its heart and feel its life currents. We must place ourselves in sympathy with these ancient peoples, listen to their hymns and prayers, and witness their rites and ceremonies. We must endeavor to know their religious ideals. When Thales declared all things were full of gods, and when Buddha denied that there were any other gods except the Supreme Being, both were stating their religious convictions. The external aspect of a religion as presented to strangers is not one often to be trusted. In the earliest and purest days of Christianity, if we were to believe the most enlightened of the heathen writers, the Christian religion consisted of the worship of animals. This idea possibly arose from the fact that the earliest pictures of Mary nursing Christ show the cow's horns of the Egyptian goddess Sati on her head, and sometimes the horns of Hathor. From the Book of the Dead, Hathor in Egyptian means the house of horns. Hathor is frequently represented with the attributes of Isis. Hathor symbolizes and personifies not only all that is beautiful, but also all that is true. Isis was the personification of the female or creative attribute of the deity. Sati had the same attributes as Hathor. She wears the crown of Upper Egypt with cow's horns and symbolizes motherhood. Mueller in Ancestral Worship says, "Ancestral worship sprang out of the universal faith of primitive peoples in the persistence of human responsibility after death. This form of worship seems to have been almost universal among mankind during a certain stage of development. Traces of it are found in all parts of the earth. The religious ideas of the Hebrews present traces of ancestral worship. The indication is strong that the special God of the Hebrew patriarch, the family God of Abraham, with whom he conversed and held personal relations, represented an ancestral divinity. From the reading of a number of ancient writings, I have come to the conclusion that ancestral worship originated through the destruction of Mu. Ancestral worship, or the reverence shown to forefathers, appears prominently in the Egyptian sacred rites and ceremonies where their forefathers of the land of Mu furnished the principal theme. It is also reflected in the inscriptions on some of the Maya monuments, also in the Greek alphabet. Muller, in Origin of Religious Laws, says, "The belief that the religious lawgiver enjoyed some closer intimacy with the deity than ordinary mortals pervades the ancient traditions of many nations." According to a well-known passage in Diodorus Siculus, the Egyptians believed their laws to have been communicated to Nevis by Hermes. The Cretans held that Minos received the laws from Zeus. The Lacedaemonians held that Lycurgus received the laws from Apollon. The Aryans believed that Zoroastes received them from the Good Spirit. According to Gattel, Zamolstis received his laws from the goddess Hestia. And according to the Jews, Moses received his laws from the god Yah. There was a primitive Aryan religion, a primitive Semitic religion, and a primitive Turanian religion before each of these primeval races were broken up and became separate in language, worship, and national sentiment. The highest god received the same name in the ancient mythology of India, Greece, Italy, and Germany, and had retained that name whether worshipped in the Himalayan mountains or among the oaks of Dodona on the capital or in the forests of Germany. He shows that his name was Dios in Sanskrit, Zeus in Greek, Jovis in Latin, and Tiu in German. They bring before us, with all the vividness of an event which we witness ourselves but yesterday, the ancestors of the whole Aryan race, thousands of years it may be before Homer and the Veda, worshipping an unseen being under the same name, the best, the most exalted name they could find in their vocabulary, under the name light and sky. Let us not turn away and say that this, after all, was nature worship and an idolatry. It was not meant for that, although it may have been degenerated into that in later times. Dios did not mean the blue sky, nor was it the sky personified. It was meant for something else. We have in the Veda the invocation Dios Pitar, the Greek Zeus Pater, and the Latin Jupiter, and that means in all these languages what it meant before these languages were torn asunder. It means Heaven Father or Heavenly Father. Owen, writing on the ancient religion of China, says, "The oldest classics in China, going back to the time of Abraham, show a wonderful knowledge of God. There are passages in these classics about God worthy to stand side by side with kindred passages in the Bible. God was omnipotent, omniscient, and omnipresent, the moral governor of the world and the impartial judge of men. Man's first religion was a simple, pure worship of the deity. The extravagances which later crept into and disfigured it were the results of that inevitable degradation which priesthood always elicits or inflicts upon great ideas committed to its charge. The original religion became discordant in many particulars and sorely overlaid by corruptions, inventions, and misconceptions. Manetho, the Egyptian historian, tells us that animal worship was introduced into Egypt in the reign of the second king of the 11th dynasty. In all my Egyptian research work, I have been unable to find any traces of animal worship during the early dynasties, and it is rarely even referred to between the age of Khufu and the reign of Ramses II. What is shown, however, is that quite early the Egyptians apparently began to worship the symbols instead of what they represented, which was the first step that led to animal worship. Manetho says it was not until the 18th dynasty that animal forms of gods were depicted in the memorial chambers of the departed. Under Thothmes III, these figures are constantly met with, having the head of the symbolic animal that was embalmed. After the reign of Ramses, the worship of animals grew and expanded greatly. Here is an example of an unscrupulous priesthood craving for power and control of wealth, degrading the pure, simple, beautiful Osirian religion as taught by Thoth of Sais to accomplish their ends. From ancient records, it would appear that about 2000 BC, religions all over the world became degraded, dropping in many places to fiendish human sacrifices. Only Moses stood up against it and kept his people in the true road. They have been called God's favored people. They were favored when they were selected to retain and carry on the worship of the deity. They were called upon and were not found wanting. The creation of the world and man has ever held a prominent place in the mind of man, for as soon as we know anything about the thoughts of man, we find he has a conception about creation. It matters not whether it is the conception of the prehistoric sages, the more modern philosopher, or the present-day cannibalistic savages. All conceptions of the creation are substantially the same. They may vary a little in phraseology, and do, but the main points are identically the same, showing what they all have a common origin. This subject, the creation, permeates the writings and traditions of prehistoric and ancient peoples. These traditions have been handed down to us and have been accepted by us because science and geology prove them to be correct. All of the prehistoric writings are written in symbolic phrases, and symbols are used in place of the names of the actual objects. Knowing the import of these symbols, however, makes reading of them easy, so that we arrive at their true meanings and they become perfectly intelligible and understandable. Throughout all ancient traditions, even down to the time of Moses, we see water above the firmament and waters below, a distinction between being thus made by pluralizing. Water in all these cases refers to the ether which fills space beyond the atmosphere. There can be no question about it. All traditions of the creation, wherever found, have a common origin. It matters not whether it is our biblical traditions, the traditions of the Hindus, Chaldeans, Egyptians, Mayas, Polynesians, or others. Their original source was the same and dates back to very early man, tens of thousands of years ago, and maybe even more. A dissection of all the traditions brings some astonishing facts before the eyes of the reader. Probably the most astounding of all is the fact that the Polynesians, who have been shut in from the rest of the world for over 12,000 years, should have among themselves traditions of the creation identical with the biblical account, such as the names of the first man and woman, and that the first woman was made out of man's bones, that man was a special creation of God. The Marquesans and other Polynesians could not possibly have got these traditions from the outside world. The traditions of the Polynesians start from 12,000 years back, and how much more no one can surmise. The biblical tradition started with Moses some 3,000 years ago, which proves that it was handed down to Moses in some form. The Nakal and Egyptians show us in what form it was handed down and from whom. Serpents. From the most remote times, the serpent has been held by every people in the greatest veneration as the embodiment of divine wisdom. In my research work, I have invariably found that all myths have a foundation, and that the foundation is some legend or tradition. The myths, inventions, legends, and traditions about the serpent are exceedingly numerous. Let us now see the result of a little research. Eusebius tells us that the Egyptians called the creator Kneph, who was symbolized by a serpent. This makes clear why the serpent was held in such high veneration by the ancients. The serpent was their symbol for the creator. The Mayas in their sculptures represented the creator of all things as being protected within the coils of a serpent. Much is to be learnt from the Hindu on the subject. Manava Dharma Shastra, a Hindu book, refers to the serpent as the creator. In Aitareya Brahmana, a Hindu book, we find Sarparajni, the queen of the serpents, the mother of all that moves, and again Kaisha, the seven-headed serpent, the creator. The Mayas of America symbolize the creator with Aakchapat, the seven-headed serpent. In Popol Vuh, the Quiche sacred book, we have the creator, the maker, the dominator, the serpent covered with feathers. After many years of research, including an examination of what has been written about the serpent by modern writers, the perusal of many ancient writings and inscriptions, considering legends, traditions, and myths, and noting where and how the ancient carvings of the serpent have been placed and used, the following are my deductions. 1. Much of what has been written by our present-day scientists and authors has not a particle of foundation for it. It is purely speculative. 2. The serpent adorned as with feathers, wings, or a plurality of heads is a symbol only of the Creator and creation. 3. The serpent unadorned was the symbol of the waters. The circular serpent was one of the symbols used for the universe. Let us now see what grounds there are for many various deductions. 1. The serpent adorned. This has been shown to be the symbol of the Creator among the Mayas, Hindus, and Egyptians. 2. The serpent unadorned is the ancient symbol for the waters. From the Maya, we find that it was selected because the movements of its body were a duplication of the ocean's role. It originated in the motherland, and from there was carried to Burma, India, and Babylonia, and from the motherland to Yucatan, to Central America, Greece, Asia Minor, and Egypt. The serpent unadorned being the symbol of the waters, and the waters being the mother of nature's life, the serpent naturally, in the ancient mind, was associated with creation. The ancients, however, appear to have been careful to differentiate between the deity and nature's creative forces by adorning the serpent that symbolizes the great creator. In all the ancient writings, the sun is always symbolically shown as fighting and overcoming the serpent of the waters, the unadorned one. In dealing with this symbolism, many writers have erred. They have failed to differentiate between the symbol of the waters and the symbol of the Creator, both being serpents. The sun is not fighting the serpent of the waters, as a matter of fact. He is not symbolized as fighting at all. The spear, arrow, or dart is the symbol of activity. The sun's force are penetrating the waters and bringing into life the cosmic eggs that are contained therein. In Egypt, we find Horus, symbol of the sun, piercing the head of the serpent Apophis, the waters, with a spear. In Greece, Apollo, their symbol of the sun, overcomes the serpent Python, their symbol of the waters. In India, Vishnu, the sun, overcomes Anatha, the serpent, the symbol of the waters. The Christians in some way received this conception, for to this day the Church of Rome pictures the Virgin Mary with a serpent at her feet. 3. The serpent circular. A circular serpent, having its tail in its mouth, is one of the oldest symbols for the universe. I found it in Nakal pictures. The Egyptians sometimes used it as a part of the headdress of their serpents for the deity, of their symbols for the deity. The seven-headed serpent, the symbol of the Creator and creation, was fully explained in the first chapter of this book. The tree and the serpent. Innumerable legends color ancient and modern literature about the tree of life and the serpent. All these legends have drifted into myths, and finally, a good crop of apples grew on the tree. These apples became necessary to carry out the myth, for without them, how was Eve to tempt Adam? They were necessary to cause Adam's fall, according to the myth. Thus, through this myth, poor woman has been accused of being the cause of all the evils that have fallen to man. A monumental piece of cowardice on the part of man, and Ezra was to blame. Had Ezra been able to read correctly the symbols which appeared in the writings of Moses, it would have been a very different version of the wily old serpent and the tree of life. The small cut is a vignette from the sacred writings. I must first mention, in regard to the religious conceptions of early man, that he was taught there was only one real life on this earth, man's soul, which was sometimes called by the ancients the man, also the inner man. Man's material body was only a temporary habitation. All other forms of what we call life are also of a temporary nature, taken from the earth and to Mother Earth returned. Of all the forms of earthly creations, man only had an imperishable part, which survived the material body and lived on forever. Therefore, man's soul was the only true life on earth. Man first appeared on earth in the land of Mu. Therefore, the first actual life on earth appeared in Mu. Man was also spoken of as a fruit. Trees bear fruit, and man was the first fruit of a tree, and the fruit was life. The land of Mu was the tree of life. Thus Mu was symbolized as a tree, the tree of life. The vignette in the Nakal writing shows the tree with a serpent coiled around it, thus surrounding the tree. The serpent is called Khan, the unadorned serpent. Therefore this serpent is the symbol of the waters. It is symbolically shown that Mu was surrounded by water. Mu had no land connection with any other continent. The serpent is the waters surrounding Mu. The foregoing shows clearly and intelligently explains what the tree of life was and why a serpent is coiled around it. In the biblical legend, it states that angels wielded swords of fire around the Garden of Eden, Mu, to prevent the re-entry of Adam and Eve. Here, Ezra failed to read correctly a compound Egyptian glyph. The glyph reads, Mu sinking into a fiery abyss. The flames of the fires of the underneath rose and enveloped her body as she went down. Her sinking and submergence made it impossible for man to return to the land. Mu, the Garden of Eden, was dead and buried beneath the waters. One of the reasons why the ancients assigned so many symbols to the deity was because they thought themselves unworthy to mention his name, and always referred to him as the Nameless. The various symbols represented his various attributes. We now come to a subject that has generally been placed before the public in a manner that has caused false impressions to be entertained: ancient religious rites and ceremonies. Whether the writers have been incapable of translating correctly or are ignorant of the subject, I am not prepared to say, nor does it interest me, but the writings on these subjects that have found their way into print have generally attempted to cast a blot on ancient religions in the minds of the readers instead of reverence for our forefathers who so faithfully tried to apprehend the deity. It is the true understanding of the ancients that makes Max Muller's writing so fascinating. I most envy his power of concentration and his ability of allowing his soul to carry back his mind and mentally to associate with and live in the hearts of the people he is writing about. All rites and ceremonies practiced in the ancient temples were symbolical, not literal, as is generally thought by writers on this subject. They were symbolical of the life a man must lead to attain perfection, so that in the end, when the time came for him to pass into the great beyond, he would do so with a clear conscience and without trepidation. They tried to symbolize to him what heaven was, what God was, and the glory that awaited him if he were not found wanting. Many of their conceptions would appear ridiculous to us today, were it not for the fact that we can mentally place ourselves beside them, appreciate their untutored mentality, and realize that at that time the teachings and the mode of teaching were as complex as could be comprehended. Max Muller was absolutely correct when he wrote, "One should never judge any of the ancient religions from appearances. We must first remember that all we see is symbolical and not literal." A great blot, however, came upon and disfigured the escutcheon of ancient religions. The Mayas, Egyptians, Phoenicians, and others of the ancients, about 3,000 years ago, turned the pure worship of God into horrible forms of idolatry. They were taught by the unscrupulous priesthood to worship first the symbols, then fetishes of wood and stone, and finally the crowning horror and disgrace, human sacrifice. It is known that the early books of our Old Testament were written by Moses from Egyptian temple records. Hieroglyphics and symbols were the common form of writing in ancient times. A hieroglyphic or a symbol is an emblem of something and therefore must not be taken literally. They must be taken as representing something, but not as that something itself. The failure to differentiate between the symbol and what it represents has caused many decipherings and translations to be erroneous, and often in religious matters leaves the impression of idolatry where there is a profound reverence for and a worship of the deity. This has been especially prominent in deciphering and translating records relating to the Osirian religion. By Osirian religion, I mean that taught by Thoth at Sais, at the commencement of Egyptian history, and not as it was preached and taught and practiced by the unscrupulous Egyptian priesthood of a later period, which commenced during the reign of the second king of the 11th dynasty and reached its climax during the 18th dynasty. According to the Old Testament, Moses wrote that man was a special creation and made his advent on earth in the Garden of Eden. Where was the Garden of Eden? The biblical boundaries of the Garden of Eden are geographically impossible, as anyone can see by consulting an atlas and tracing them. Rivers are made to run over mountains and across oceans. Here is a biblical error. How did it occur? Moses was a master. He had attained the highest degrees in religion and learning. It would have been impossible for him to have suggested such impossibilities, so that we must look elsewhere to find the origin of the many biblical errors. What Moses wrote, without doubt, were plain facts in symbolical language, a symbolically written history, true in all respects. Subsequent translations perverted his writings. The writings of Moses were in Egyptian hieroglyphics and hieratic characters. I have been informed by Hebrew scientists that some were on clay tablets, others on papyrus. This point I pass on as I received it. 800 years after the Israelitish exodus from Egypt, Ezra, with a body of co-workers, collected all the tablets and writings of all the descriptions which were connected with the family history of the Israelites and put them into book form, which became the Bible. Those written by Moses were in Egyptian hieroglyphics. Is it any wonder that so many mistranslations were made by Ezra and his associates when none of them was capable of thoroughly understanding the Egyptian writings of Moses? Only a master could understand them, and neither Ezra or any of his associates were masters. Their incapability is clearly shown by comparing their translations with the original records which we find in the Egyptian, Chaldean, Hindu, and Mayan. Moses wrote sense. His translators made nonsense out of many of his passages. Moses wrote in the symbolical style of his day, and his translators tried to translate literally. In this they only half succeeded, and when they came across a set of hieroglyphics they did not understand, they added myth to sound history. The boundaries of the Garden of Eden form one of their myths. From incontrovertible evidences gained through my research work, it is shown that Moses wrote the first books of the Bible from the temple records brought to Egypt from the motherland by the Nakals via Burma and India, and that these Egyptian temple records were copies of the 7 sacred inspired writings of the motherland, Mu. These were written on clay tablets and referred to the creation. The legends of the Garden of Eden, the flood, the last magnetic cataclysm, and the raising of the mountains are records of later date. Moses could have made no mistake in copying these writings, so they undoubtedly left his hands perfect copies of the originals. 800 years later, an attempt was made to translate them into Hebrew by men who did not understand the old Egyptian esoteric temple writings, hence the difference between what was produced and the original. So little did Ezra and his associates understand these writings that I doubt if there is a single Hebrew today who knows the meaning of the burnt sacrifice and what it symbolized. Before the submersion of Mu, the word sacrifice was unknown in any language. It was coined to describe the way in which Mu was destroyed, and a fire upon an altar symbolizes the remembrance of the beloved motherland. Ancestral worship. The worship of ancestors, or ancestral worship, is so universally acknowledged to be of common origin that I think it necessary to prove it here, so I shall confine myself to showing what land it was that first fathered this custom. In order to do this, I shall quote from records of many countries. Egypt, Papyrus 4, Bulak Museum. Bring offering to thy father and to thy mother, who rest in the valley of tombs, for he who gives these offerings is as acceptable to the gods as if they were brought to themselves. Often visit the dead, so that thou doest for them, they may do for thee. India, the Dharmalastra. The ceremony in honor of the Manis is superior for the Brahmins to the worship of the gods, and the offerings to the gods that make place before the offerings to the Manis have been declared to increase their merit. China. Confucius in Kongtsen, the whole of chapter 19 is dedicated to the description of the ceremony in honor of ancestors, as practiced twice a year in the spring and in the autumn. Confucius in Lunyu says, "It is necessary to sacrifice to the ancestors as if they were present." Japan, on the 15th day of the Japanese 7th month, a festival is held in honor of their ancestors, when a repast of fruit and vegetables is placed before the ites on wooden tables of peculiar shape, on which are written inscriptions commemorative of the dead. Peru, Fables and Rites of the Incas, pages 36 to 50. These festivals were established to commemorate deceased friends and relatives. They were celebrated with tears, mournful song, plaintive music, and by visiting the tombs of the dear departed, whose provision of corn and chichaha they received through openings arranged on purpose from the exterior of the tomb to vessels placed near the body. The Peruvians had great festivals in honor of the dead in the month of Ayamarca. Laplangian in Central America says, even today the aborigines of Yucatan, Pitan, and other countries of Central America, where the Mayan language is spoken, are wont at the beginning of November to hang from the branches of certain trees in clearings of the forest, at crossroads and in isolated nooks, cakes made of the best corn and meal they can procure. These are for the souls of the departed. R.G. Halliburton, who is considered one of our best authorities on ancestral worship, is writing of the Festival of Ancestors, says, it is now, as it was formerly, held at or near the beginning of November by the Peruvians, the Hindus, the Pacific Islanders, the people of the Tonga Islands, the Australians, the ancient Persians, the ancient Egyptians, and the northern nations of Europe, and continues for 3 days among the Japanese, the Hindus, the Australians, the ancient Romans, and the ancient Egyptians. This startling fact at once drew my attention to the question, how was this uniformity in the name of observance preserved, not only in far distant quarters of the globe, but also through what vast lapse of time since the Peruvians and Indo-Chinese first inherited this primeval festival from a common source? Between the columns in the Temple of Sacred Mysteries at Uxmal there was a grand altar, and on this altar, placed at the door of the inner chamber, they were wont to make offerings to their manis. This decides the land of common origin. The offerings to ancestors was a sacred rite and was practiced in the Temple of Sacred Mysteries. It has already been shown that the sacred rites and ceremonies practiced in this temple came from the motherland. Therefore, the land of Mu originated ancestral worship. The custom remains dear to us today, though in a modified form. For do we not visit and place flowers on the graves of our dear departed ones? Little do those who thus place flowers on graves know that the ceremony originated more than 12,000 years ago, and that they are practicing a very ancient ceremony. Language. Language is admitted to be the most accurate guide in tracing the family relations of various peoples, even when inhabiting countries that are separated by vast expanses of water and extensive land. A startling fact is that we find Maya words in every language of the world. In Japan, one half of their language is Karamaya. In India, a large portion of the languages spoken came, without a doubt, from the Naga Maya. The proportion, however, varies in each language. The Canadian Singhalese is full of the original Maya words, and all of the European languages are permeated with them, especially the Greek, whose alphabet is composed of Karamaya vocables. Fully 50% of the Mexican Indian language is Karamaya. A Mexican Indian and a Japanese can converse intelligibly without the aid of an interpreter. So many words are common to both languages. The same may be said of the Incas. The old Akkadian and Chaldean languages were largely Naga Maya, also the Egyptian. One might, with research, go on indefinitely to prove the common origin. Naturally, time has made many changes in words. This is inevitable, of course, but the root still remains in many of these changes. For instance, in Greek we often find the letter G replacing the Maya K, D often replaces the Maya T, and R often replaces the Maya L. This last replacement, by the way, occurs in many languages. In all words where the letter C is pronounced K, the word will be found to come out of the Maya. The greatest changes in language, however, are found where the art of writing is unknown, and where the grammar has been lost or is unknown. Max Muller says, there was an original language. This statement is confirmed wherever a study of language and its origin is made. In all languages are to be found some words, roots of words, and vocables, which are identically the same, and in all instances they are found to convey substantially the same meanings, thus proving a common origin. In 6,000 years of history we find this statement: the comparison of words in Sanskrit, the ancient language of the Hindu, Zend, the old speech of Persia, Greek, Latin, English, and other languages, has shown that all these languages came from a distant common original, spoken by some race yet unparted by migration. In all, or nearly all of these tongues, the names of common things and persons, the words expressing simple instruments and actions, the words for family relations such as father, brother, daughter, and son, the early numerals, the pronouns, the very endings of nouns and verbs, and substantially the same. Accident could not have caused this phenomenon, and since many of the nations speaking thus have for long ages been parted from each other by vast stretches of the earth's broad surface, they could not learn them in historic times from one another. Borrowing and imitation being thus excluded, the only possible account is that these words and forms were carried with them by the migratory Aryan tribes as part of the possession once shared by all in their original home. Each of these universal words may be traced back to the ancient Mother Maya language. The natural deduction, therefore, is that the Maya tongue was the mother tongue, or one of the very earliest offshoots from it. It must be understood that the present Maya language is no more like the Maya language of 5,000 or 10,000 years ago than the English of today is like that of 500 years ago. The Maya language of today is very much like the English language, made up of various other languages that are intertwined with the original, these changes being brought about by conquests. Much Aztec and Nahuatl has been added to the original Maya. The original language was, without doubt, very contracted and short of words, so that one word had many meanings. As far as I have been able to decipher ancient writings, I should say that the meaning of a word would somewhat depend on its position in a sentence, and how the word was accented when it consisted of more than one syllable. For instance, the Maya word Ma means mother, earth, and country. In the Egyptian, the word Ma also means mother, earth, and country, but when prefixed to nouns, verbs, or adjectives, it is the sign of negation. This also occurs in the Greek and Sinhalese languages. To show how the ancient Maya words had more than one meaning, I have selected a few from Bresser's translations. English: Nagamaya, be, to go, to leave, to walk, to move, to progress. Chi, a mouth, an opening, a border, an edging. Ka, the soul, barriers, sediments, anything ejected. Kachak, exceedingly abundant, plentiful. Kab, a hand, an arm, a branch, anything extending. Kak, to finish, a fire, to burn, to destroy. Kul, to worship, the seal, the rump. Lal, to empty, to take away, to dispose of. Ni, a point, a ridge, a summit, a mountain. On, circular. On onks, circular, whirling, whirlpool, a tornado. Pa, a break, an opening, to open. Ta, where, a place, smooth, ground, level ground. Tan, towards, near, before, in the center. Tel, deep, depth, bottom, abyss. Z, cold, frozen, vapor, smoke. Ha, water, moisture. Pe, come, from, out. On account of the ancient words having so many meanings, it becomes an exceedingly difficult task to translate the ancient writings and inscriptions so as to convey in modern language the thoughts of the ancients. Although the general meaning may be set forth, I doubt whether the exact meaning in all details is ever obtained. Translations are, to a great extent, dependent upon the temperament of the translator. If, for instance, he has an Oriental mind, his translations will be figurative, flowery, and often exaggerated. whereas if the translator be of a phlegmatic nature, his translations are apt to be of a cold, blunt, abrupt, curtailed nature. The four genii. The four genii is another ancient conception. They are found in all histories and traditions of the creation. Hitherto their origin has been untraceable. The Mexican tablets, however, give their complete history and origin. As heretofore shown, there were four great primary forces that by command of the great Creator carried out creation, and when creation was completed, these four great forces were given charge of the physical universe. The very, very ancients call them the four pillars of heaven. That is, they sustained and upheld the creations that had been completed. The very, very ancients had another meaning. Their expression, pillars of heaven, meant pillars of him who dwells in heaven. The ancient symbol for the earth was a square. The square has four cardinal points, north, south, east, and west. Then the conception came that heaven was sustained by the four pillars which were resting on the four corners of the earth. To carry out some form of symbology, what I do not know, each pillar had a keeper appointed to take charge of it. These keepers were called the four genii. The Maya, Khan Bakab, the yellow Bakab, placed in the south, Chak Bakab, the red Bakab, placed in the east, Zak Bakab, the white Bakab, placed in the north, Ek Bakab, the black Bakab, placed in the south. Egyptian. According to the Egyptian, there were four genii of Amenti, one placed at each cardinal point. Amset, the genius at the cardinal point in the east, Hapu, the genius at the cardinal point in the west, Tesotmutf, the genius at the cardinal point in the north, Kabsanuf, the genius at the cardinal point in the south. Chaldean. The four protecting genii of the human race as believed in by the Chaldeans were Sed Alep, or Kirub, represented as a bull with a human face, Lamas, or Nigal, represented as a lion with a man's head, Ustar, after the human likeness, Natig, represented with the head of an eagle. Hindu. Four gods or genii who presided at the four cardinal points. Indra, king of heaven, placed in the east. Varuna, the god of waters, placed in the west. Ruvera, god of wealth, placed in the north. Yama, the judge of the dead, placed in the south. Chinese. The four mountains, Tse-yo of the Chinese, four quarters of the globe, as they were wont to designate their country, are Taitsong being the yo of the east, Sangfu being the yo of the west, Chensi being the yo of the north, Hao Koang being the yo of the south. Jewish. The conception of the four gods, pillars, or genii, or whatever they may be termed, was not entirely rejected by the Jews. Although there is no mention of them in the books written by Moses, that is no criterion, because some of the books written by Moses were lost, and the reference to the four cardinal points may have been in one of the last books. Later we see the conception among the Jews in Ezekiel 1:10. They four had a face of a man, the face of a lion, the face of an ox, and the face of an eagle. And in 10:14, the first face was that of a cherub, the second that of a man, the third that of a lion, and the fourth that of an eagle. The foregoing is given as a vision of Ezekiel. At the time he wrote these lines, he was a captive among the Chaldeans. Let me compare his vision with the Chaldean creed, which had been in existence for thousands of years, because these conceptions came from the motherland, either through the Caucasian colony or through the Nakals from India. Chaldean, four genii, human face, bull, lion, eagle. Ezekiel, four beasts, man, ox, lion, eagle. If Ezekiel's vision was not an embellishment of the Chaldean creed, I should like to know what it was. Four of these very beasts are now in the British Museum, having been brought there from the ruins of Nineveh. Ezekiel was without question familiar with them, as they were among the common architectural adornments of prominent buildings. The triune Godhead. The conception of a Trinity or triune Godhead has been handed down to us from the beginning of man. It was preserved in the works of the philosophers, and is still held sacred by many, among them the Christians and the Brahmins. The ancient symbol for the Trinity was one of the oldest of the sacred symbols, the equilateral triangle. Whenever or wherever this symbol is found in any form of record or inscription, it is either in reference to or represents the ancient Trinity and heaven. Maya, the equilateral triangle represented the Trinity, is constantly found among the temple carvings of Yucatan. I have, however, been unable satisfactorily to determine the original names of the Maya triune Godhead. Leplangian and others have given sets of 3 and even 5, which form the full Godhead. But to me all of them appear incorrect from the fact that names are given of people who lived tens of thousands of years after the triune Godhead was conceived. Guatemala, Popol Vuh, all that exists is the work of Tzkal, the Creator, who by his will caused the universe to spring into existence, and whose names are Betal the Maker, Alom the Engenderer, and Qualom, he who gives being. Tzkal is shown as the collective God. Peru, the Incas of Peru worshipped a mighty unseen being who they believed had created all things, for which reason they called him Pachacamac. He being incomprehensible, they did not present him under any shape or name. Pachacamac stood at the head of a trinity composed of himself, Pachacamac, Khan, and Yuarakoka. Hindu. In the Sri Santra of the Hindus, the great Om, the Nameless, is figured as a trinity by the equilateral triangle. In the Hindu book Nirukta, it is 3 times affirmed that there are 3 gods only, and that these 3 gods designate one sole deity. The gods are 3 only. Prajapati, or he is sometimes called Mahatma, the Lord of all creatures, is the collective God. Chaldean. The Chaldeans symbolized Ensof, the great light, as a trinity by the equilateral triangle. Egyptian. The triune godhead of the Egyptians consisted of Shu, Set, and Horus. Greek. Plato and Orpheus refer to the trinity as 3 kings, Phanes, Uranos, and Kronos. Proclus asserts that the demiurgos or creator is triple. The 3 component parts of the deity are 3 intellects or kings: he who exists, he who possesses, and he who beholds. Pythagoras taught his disciples that God was numbers and harmony. He caused them to honor numbers and the equilateral triangle with the name of God. Christian churches. We see in the ancient Catholic churches over the main altar an equilateral triangle, and within it an eye. The addition of the eye to the triangle originated in Egypt, the all-seeing eye of Osiris. For many years I searched in India, trying to find out the origin of the conception of the Trinity. I traced it back to the motherland, without finding its origin. One day, talking about it with my old Hindu friend, he said, "There is a legend about it. It may be truth or it may be a myth, I cannot say. The legend tells that the motherland consisted of 3 lands, that each land was raised by a separate god, so that it took 3 gods to raise the whole continent, but that the 3 gods were only one after all being joined together like the sides of a triangle. I shall say to you, as my dear old friend said to me, it may be the truth or it may be a myth, I cannot say." Chapter 16. Ancient Sacred Mysteries, Rites, and Ceremonies. By aid of the Popol Vuh and decipherings of the writings within the Great Pyramid at Cairo, I am enabled to describe some of the ancient mysteries, rites, and ceremonies. Leplangian translated the Popol Vuh into English from Bresser's French translation, checking it himself with the original Maya. He kindly lent me this copy, from which to make notes. The following from the Popol Vuh, therefore, comes through Leplangian. In Guatemala, the Quiche Mayas disclosed their sacred mysteries to the applicants in several steps or degrees. After the first step, or initiatory degree, the remainder were conducted in 6 chambers, or houses. Some of these trials or degrees are exceedingly interesting, as we find them practiced later by the Egyptians and reflected all through the Old Testament. First initiatory step. In this step, the applicants for initiation to the sacred mysteries were made to cross two rivers, one of mud, the other of blood, before they reached the four roads which led to the place where the priests were awaiting them. The crossing of these rivers was full of dangers that were to be avoided. Then they had to journey along four roads, the white, the red, the green, and the black, that led to where awaited the council, composed of 12 priests, veiled, and a wooden statue dressed and wearing the ornaments of a priest. While in presence of the council, the initiates were told to salute the king, pointing to the wooden statue. This was to try their discernment. Then they had to salute each individual, giving his name or title without being told, after which they were invited to sit down on a certain seat. If, forgetting the respect due to the august assembly, they sat as invited, they soon had reason to regret their want of breeding and proper preparation, for the seat made of stone was burning hot. Having modestly declined the invitation, they were led to the second trial. The dark house. In the dark house they had to pass the night and submit to the second trial. Guards were placed around to prevent the candidates from holding intercourse with the outer world. Next, a lighted torch of pine wood and a cigar were given to each. These were not to be extinguished, still they had to be returned whole at sunrise, when the officers in charge of the house came to demand them. Woe to him who allowed his cigar and his torch to be consumed. Terrible chastisement, even death, awaited him. Having passed through this second trial successfully, the third trial was to be suffered in. The House of Spears. In the House of Spears, the applicants had to produce 4 pots of certain rare flowers without communicating with anyone outside and without having brought them. They had also to defend themselves against the attacks of the best spearmen, selected for the purpose, one for each candidate. Coming out victorious at dawn, they were judged worthy of the 4th trial. This consisted in being shut up a whole night in the ice house. In the ice house, the cold was intense. They had to prevent themselves from being overcome by the cold and freezing to death. Their 5th trial then took place. The tiger house. In the tiger house, they were exposed to the danger of being devoured by ferocious animals. Emerging safely from the den of tigers, they were ready to submit to the 6th trial. The fiery house. This was a burning fiery furnace where they had to remain from sunset to sunrise. Leaving this unscorched, they were deemed worthy to undergo the 7th and final trial, the severest of all, the House of the Bat. This was the house of Kamazots, the god of the bats, and was full of death-dealing weapons. Here the god himself, coming from on high, appeared to the candidates and beheaded them if found off their guard. The foregoing is a synopsis of Laplangian's translations. He says these rites were practiced at Xibalba, a place in the heart of the Guatemala mountains. I am afraid Laplangian has failed to give the correct impressions as regards the trials. He should have told his readers that they were all symbolical, whereas he has tried to leave the impression that they were literal, thereby attempting to produce a blood-curdling, awe-inspiring supernatural mystery. Laplangian, however, forgot himself on one occasion, for he states in the first trial that the candidate is prepared beforehand, therefore knowing what to say, what to do, and how to act. In other words, the candidate has been previously taught his lessons, and these trials were examinations to ascertain whether he knew them. The aforesaid is fully borne out by what is found on the walls of the temple within the Great Pyramid at Cairo. Here it is stated that the candidate is prepared beforehand and that a friendly spirit, an instructor, accompanies him and guides him through all his trials. When one comes across any literary matter referring to the bat as a Maya symbol, it is invariably found that the writer says the Mayas looked upon the bat as a god and worshipped it as such. The Mayas did not look upon the bat as a god, nor did they worship it. This is so clearly shown in the 7th trial, the House of the Bat, that it is beyond controversy. How can it be called bat worship when it is distinctly stated that the Lord comes down from on high to see and to finally pass the candidate? The whole ceremony is a symbolical one, showing the candidate how he must be prepared to meet the end when it comes. The Pyramid Temple. I shall now compare the ancient Egyptian sacred mysteries, as disclosed by the temple within the Great Pyramid near Cairo, with those of the Mayas as disclosed in the Popol Vuh. The entrance door was placed in the north, and was a single stone in the form of an equilateral triangle surmounting a square, and revolved on a pivot or apex. This was symbolical of heaven and earth. Through these the postulant must pass, for they symbolize the passage from a present to a future life. There were 12 entrances to pass through before attaining the Grand Orient, with secrets and trials restricted to each. The first could not be seen. It was apparently a blank, and was guarded by Horus. It was a blank or nothingness because the postulant was blind and bereft of his senses except motion. This portal had to be passed through with the aid of a friendly spirit. Having passed through the portal, he was conducted down these passages by a friendly spirit he could not see, and was taken to the place of initiation, where his manis were regenerated by the descent of the soul to the expecting postulants. He was then conducted to the chamber of central fire, which he extinguished. Book of the Dead, chapter 22. I come, I do that which my heart wishes on the day of the fire, when I extinguish the flames as soon as they appear. And chapter 25. I make the man remember his name in the house of flame. References to the tank of fire are constantly met with throughout the Book of the Dead, and are generally accompanied by the foregoing glyph or vignette. From the chamber of central fire, the tank of fire, the postulant was conducted up the grand horizon of heaven, and came to a portal. Questions were asked, which he answered, and then he passed through and was able to see. Light was given to him, and he then beheld his friendly guide. He was next conducted into the chamber of the shadow, judgment of the justified, truth and darkness, the 7 halls of death. Here he had to pass an examination, and words were given him which he had to remember before being led on to the second portal, where he was required to give answers permitting him to enter. Having passed through the second stage, the adept was allowed to enter the hall called the 10th Hall of Truth, or trial scene, which was depicted in a black and white tessellated pavement, right and wrong, truth and falsehood. From this hall he was conducted to the chamber of new birth, or place of coming forth, which regenerated with regeneration of soul. In this chamber were found emblems of mortality, with the sarcophagus empty. A small opening admits the light of the bright morning star Sothis into the chamber. The rest of the chamber reminded the adept of what he passed through. He now emerged from the tomb. Next he was taken to the throne of regeneration of the soul, and investiture of illumination took place. Then he experienced more ordeals to attain to the chamber of the Orient, to the throne of Ra, to become a master. The uncreated light from which was pointed out the whole happiness of the future he could see for himself in the distance. After passing through another portal where he had to bend, he was conducted to the chamber of the Grand Orient. The initiate had to sustain the fiery ordeal to be approved as an adept. The adept had to become justified. The justified must then become illuminate. The illuminate must then be consummated master before he could obtain the innermost mansion of the divine house. Comparing the Egyptian with the Maya, in the Pyramid Temple there were 12 rooms or portals, in the Maya 7 houses. The Egyptian had a dark room, so also the Maya. The Egyptian had a tank of fire, the Maya a fiery house. The Egyptian had 7 halls of death, the Maya house of the bat corresponded with them. After Mu was destroyed, the peoples of the earth symbolized in some way her destruction, so that her memory should not be forgotten among coming generations. The Mayas of Yucatan erected a pyramid as a monument for her, which stands to this day. They also erected temples to her memory. The Quiche Mayas introduced it into their religious ceremonies in the form of a symbolical fiery house. The Greeks symbolized it by forming a Maya epic, which forms their alphabet today. This epic, as I have already shown, describes the manner of Mu's destruction. The Egyptians, like the Quiche Mayas, symbolized the destruction in their religious ceremonies. As the initiate advanced in religious mysteries, he symbolically passed through the scene of the destruction of his motherland, thus through life, to keep her in memory. Moses, in an abstruse manner, symbolized it in his writings, as we find in our Bible today.